Let's go live out of the Greens, though. Speaking in Canberra, it's understood they've struck a deal with the government on Labor's safeguard mechanism changes.
Mining Resources spokesperson, Senator Dorinda Cox, to announce what that position is, and then happy to take a few questions. First, before I do that, I just want to say a bit about how we've arrived at this point. As has been clear, for some months now, the Greens have been in negotiations with the government over the government's climate plans. Now, those negotiations have been in good faith. And by that, I mean, by good faith negotiations, you're clear about the other party's position, and they communicate it frankly and honestly, and you work to see whether there is any capacity of agreement. And the negotiations have been in good faith. And I want to acknowledge the Minister Bowen and his team, and also the Prime Minister and his team, for conducting those negotiations in good faith. So what I'm about to say isn't any comment on how they conducted the negotiations or the spirit of them, but it's about one of the things that's become readily apparent about this place and this parliament. Negotiating with Labor is like negotiating with the political wing of the coal and gas corporations. Labor seems more afraid of the coal and gas corporations than climate collapse. Labor seems more afraid of Woodside than global warming. And never has that been clearer than in a couple of the public statements that happened and public positions that we saw over recent weeks. On the day that the world scientists and the UN Secretary-General gave us our final warning and said countries like Australia need to stop opening coal and gas mines, the government defended more coal and gas mines. And when you look at the second way, it's become readily apparent that we are dealing here in this parliament with a government that is still captured by the coal and gas corporations, was when it came to the original design of the safeguard mechanism. Under the original design of the safeguard mechanism, pollution from coal and gas was going to go up. For those who are interested in the numbers, the pollution from the entities covered by the safeguard mechanism is about 140 megatonnes now. Under the projections, under Labor's scheme, it was going to go up between 155 and 184 megatonnes. That's how much Labor wanted to expand coal and gas in their original safeguard design. Key to any good climate policy should be stopping pollution from coal and gas, but Labor wanted to expand it. So, as you know, the Greens have been pushing hard on new coal and gas because coal and gas are the main causes of the climate crisis. And as the UN Secretary-General has said, if we're to get the climate crisis under control, we have to stop opening coal and gas mines. The Greens, through the negotiations, have secured a big hit on coal and gas. There will now be, in legislation, a hard cap on actual emissions that the safeguard sector can emit. This puts a limit on coal and gas expansion in this country. In fact, the limit must decline over time. This means a huge number of those 116 coal and gas projects in the pipeline will not be able to go ahead. This cap will be a hard cap on actual emissions, and the coal and gas corporations will not be able to offset their way out of it, no matter how many offsets they buy. On our initial calculations, this means that the equivalent emissions from about half of those 116 projects is prevented. That means about half of those 116 projects and their equivalent emissions won't be able to go ahead. There will be, in law, for the first time in this country, a limit on the amount of pollution that these corporations, including the coal and gas corporations, can pollute. And if pollution starts to rise above that and the minister doesn't take steps to fix it, they'll be breaking the law. This will be in legislation. Not only that, but for the first time, new projects that are proposed to enter the system will have to pass a pollution test. There will be a safeguard trigger in the legislation that means that if new projects coming in look likely to breach the cap, then the minister has to do something about it. The minister will have the powers under the legislation to take steps to stop the pollution going up, including potentially stopping the project by putting restrictions on them. This is a first in legislation because for the first time, new projects for coal and gas will now have to undergo a pollution test, and that wasn't there before. We've also put significant hurdles in the way of a number of the projects currently underway in the pipeline that the government and others have been backing. The Beetaloo gas field will be required from day one to offset all of its emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 for domestic use. This derails the business case for the Beetaloo. On some estimates, based on the level, of course we don't know exactly what level of the price of offsetting permits will be. On some estimates, this could add up to an additional $1 billion a year to the Beetaloo project, potentially ensuring that it doesn't go ahead. Now, it hasn't been finally stopped, but it has been derailed. And this will be a huge, huge shot in the arm to the campaigners against the Beetaloo project. Likewise, all new offshore gas projects that will be feeding into LNG terminals will be required to be zero CO2 from day one. Now, given that so many of these projects are big and have lots of CO2 in them, this will also add a substantial cost to these projects and put a huge hurdle in the way of them proceeding. We've also secured a number of other amendments, including stopping large amounts of public money going to funding new coal and gas. We've ensured that a lot of the dodgy offsets will be frozen and wiped out of the system, as well as a number of other things that will make it much harder to get new coal and gas off the ground in this country. On that basis, having secured those amendments, we will be passing the legislation through both houses of Parliament, because this is a big hit on coal and gas that has been delivered by the Greens. Now, we have stopped about half of those 116 new projects going ahead because they just won't be able to fit in to the hard pollution cap. That's our initial estimate of how much pollution has been prevented as a result of what the Greens have secured.
All right, so the Greens announcing a deal on this safeguard mechanism. This is big news. We're going to hear as well live from the Prime Minister at 11:45, and we want to get a bit of reaction to this. So we'll leave that there for now. But they haven't. The most interesting part of this, I think, is what they're calling a cap on gross emissions of 140 megatons per annum. What that means is that's a cap on emissions regardless of any sort of offsets. That's the maximum number of emissions that can come from within these 219 biggest emitters in Australia. The Greens saying any new LNG projects, export as well, would have to be net zero from day one. So sounds like a significant concession. We'll hear Labor's explanation on this as well. Sometimes they have slightly different takes on what all of this means, but that's what Adam Bandt has just announced.